Good afternoon. It is afternoon now. We're so glad you could join us today. Today's webinar offers MCLE credit for California attorneys and CE credit for workers' compensation claims examiners. All attendees must be on the webinar, able to see the slide presentation, and attend for the entire hour to receive credit. We cannot, unfortunately, the State Bar won't let us provide credit if you call in on the phone only and are unable to see the slide presentation. I want to remind you, as always, to visit our website at bradfordbarthel.com for tons of information about B&Bs. I think someone on our end needs to mute, just so you know. For tons of information about B&B, our team, and of course, our amazing value-added services. And I'm going to talk about a few of them very quickly. Our training page has over 80 hours of CE credits available to claims examiners. Additionally, you can register for upcoming live webinars. We have a couple of them coming up. We have September and October already scheduled. Our B&B blog is having a very busy week with 3 articles released in the last couple of days discussing life pension, seasonal employee earnings, and just this morning you may have received an email we sent out with a breaking news article written by John Kamen and Louis Laris about the second DCA's decision that the WCAB must stop its grant for study practice, but is not required to issue a final decision on the merits within 60 days of a petition for reconsideration. So you can learn more about all 3 of those articles on our website at our B&B blog. Don't forget about our AMA analysis and rating department for those tough medical reports. I do want to draw your attention to the handout section. So if you go to your GoToWebinar panel, there is a handout section and you will find a copy of today's PowerPoint presentation, which you can download if you'd like. Our PowerPoint is also always posted on our website under that training tab I was referring to earlier. We always encourage questions. I don't know how much time we will have for questions today, but we will try to get to 1 or 2 at the end if possible. You can submit those questions in your GoToWebinar panel under the questions section. We have a great presentation for you today with a panel of speakers and a few extras here to greet you as well. The topic is Keep On Truckin', the latest on illness, accidents, and AI in the transportation and trucking industry. It will be led by Nasir Adil, Kimberly Wagner, and special guest Eric Hunter. This is part 1 of a 2-part series, and we did schedule part 2 for October 24th. And as I already mentioned, you can register for that now. So let's move into some quick introductions here. Let's start with Tamina. Tamina, are you ready?
I am. I love it when you call me an extra, Tammy.
You are extra.
We are extra. Anyway, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for having us today. I don't think that Tammy alluded to it, but I think on the blog articles, there's also an article about yours truly. So if you get an opportunity, please do take a glance. I was so pleased to receive that from our team here, and I am so grateful and proud to have completed my 25th year with the firm just recently on July 13th. And I am even more humbled and proud of this team for taking our trucking department, our trucking division to its heights. We started out with just a handful of files, and now they've built a beautiful niche department, and they provide great updated training on this. So I'm hoping you all sit back and enjoy this. And with that, I am the managing partner for client relations. I'm out of Woodland Hills, California. I live in West Hills, California. And thank you for this opportunity. With that, I'm going to pass it on.
Hi, I'm Janine Lewis. I'm the Director of Marketing, Quality Assurance, ADR, Transportation, and Sports Marketing. And I want to welcome you all. And this is going to be a great opportunity for you all to learn a little bit more about transportation and trucking industry, and a little bit about how AI is going to come into this in the future. So I'm going to move this on over to Alex Pendleton, who's in our Anaheim office.
Aloha, everyone. This is David Alexander Pendleton. I go by Alec because there's a number of other Davids in our firm, but I've been with Bradford Barthel since 2015, work in the Anaheim office. I used to practice law in Hawaii, where I represented injured workers, was elected to the state legislature, did that for a decade, was a policy advisor to the governor before she appointed me to be a workers' compensation judge. I did that until I retired with a 20-year service in the state of Hawaii in 2014 and joined BNB in 2015. I have 4 kids, and they're all over the place. My eldest daughter is a workers' compensation defense attorney in Honolulu. So a lot of the interesting history and background, but happy to be at BNB and happy to be part of this seminar.
Thank you, Alec. Okay, Eric.
Thanks so much, Tammy. Eric Hunter, a global futurist with BNB Innovation Futures. I advise on what's next. Give a number of keynote presentations just this last year. I've been presented in Sydney, in Hamburg, London, all over the world really. And there's been a lot of focus and interest on AI, particularly large language model AI, generative AI, how that's impacting industries in conjunction with spatial compute. So looking forward to talking about that a little bit today as we close the presentation. And just something else about me is my background. I was a musician, jazz performance, bass player back in the day, wrangler on a horse ranch for a time, and currently spend a lot of time sailing. And I'll be bringing a little bit of those pieces into the presentation because oftentimes when talking about AI, it's important to incorporate perception. Thank you so much, Tammy.
Thank you, Eric. My name is Nasir Adil. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm the managing attorney of our Oakland office. I've had the pleasure of being with our firm since 2010. Seen some familiar faces sign in, so looking forward to presenting today with Kim and with Eric. Our office in Oakland primarily covers the Oakland and San Francisco boards. So again, looking forward to presenting with everyone. Of course, we're presenting today on trucking, but I just want to remind everyone after today, feel free to reach out to any of us, including myself, if you have any panel questions, doctor questions, PD questions, whatever it is, we're here for you as a firm, including myself. So please always feel free to reach out. A fun fact about me, there's not many, but one of my claims to fame, at least personally, is I once made Dave Chappelle, the infamous Dave Chappelle, I once made him laugh so hard that he himself rolled over. So I'll try and share that story at the end, but that's my lead in. And without further ado, Ms. Kimberly Wagner.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Kimberly Wagner. I have been practicing workers' compensation for about 12 years. I've been with Bradford Barthel since 2016. I am a partner and the managing attorney of the Ventura office, and I am also a certified workers' compensation specialist. My summer hobby right now is grilling. So if you don't see me in court or otherwise engaged in my practice, I will be outside grilling on my Traeger. All right, so let's get started here. This is just some information in case you need to reach us for anything. Our rating department, our videos, our blog that Tammy talked about. This is our team here. So let's get started. Trucking and transportation are, of course, an important part of any economy to keep the supply chain moving, the disruption of which can be catastrophic, as we saw with the COVID-19 pandemic. California has the second highest number of truck drivers in the country at approximately 186,000. The state with the highest number of truck drivers is actually Texas. To put this into perspective, there are 195,000 lawyers in California, and there are 22,480 combined claims adjusters, examiners, and investigators in California. So some of you may be familiar with the litigation surrounding AB5, which spawned Prop 22. Basically, AB5 was a legislative response to companies that they felt were trying to take advantage of their workers by classifying them as independent contractors when the legislature felt they would be more appropriately treated as employees. We did already have a test in place for what an independent contractor was under Borrello, but the purpose of AB5 was to codify a test, and you'll see that once in a while when the legislature will agree so wholeheartedly with a court decision that it feels compelled to make it the law of the land through legislation. The test for an independent contractor was the Borrello test, which had 11 factors, which was sort of a totality of the circumstances evaluation of whether a worker was an independent contractor, which I'm not going to go into right now. But AB5 codified a separate test called the ABC test. And then they said that some workers were exempt from the ABC test but had to use the Borrello test. It's all a bit confusing, and I won't go into the specifics of the tests because that could be a presentation on its own. But for our purposes, I'm just going to talk about generally where we are right now and how this all impacts the trucking industry. So in response to the legislature statutizing, yes, that's my made-up word, Borrello and the ABC test, the voters passed Prop 22 by a 58 to 59% vote, depending on your source, which was spearheaded largely by the rideshare services. In other words, the rideshare services wanted to continue to classify their workers as independent contractors and advertise the benefits of it, like control over working hours and the option to accept work. So Prop 22 basically gutted AB 5 with the general population overruling the legislature. The unions then rushed to the defense of AB 5 to shift the tide back in favor of employment so as not to jeopardize their membership or relevance, or so cynical minds can conclude. And they filed a challenge to the constitutionality of Prop 22, basically claiming that the Prop 22 improperly limited the legislature's ability to oversee workers' compensation for certain workers, which would require a constitutional amendment. The presiding California Superior Court judge agreed that Prop 22 was unconstitutional and overturned it in the Castellanos case, but that judge was reversed by the Court of Appeal, which means that Prop 22 remains in effect except for a portion that they did strike as unconstitutional as to the restriction on collective bargaining by gig workers. So currently, the Castellanos case is under review by the California Supreme Court, which accepted the union's writ on June 28, 2023. So we are still pending the fate of Prop 22. So how does this all impact truckers? Truck drivers want to be independent contractors. Many of them own their own rigs and they work various routes for various companies, which makes sense. So practically speaking, if a truck driver drops off a load in one location and then has to return to the original pickup point, they'll often seek work delivering another load from that drop-off point back to the original pickup point or somewhere local to it to maximize efficiency and their ability to earn. Because AB 5 would impact their ability to remain classified as an independent contractor, the Truck Drivers Association, CTA, filed suit in federal court to stop enforcement of AB 5. The fact that truck drivers do engage in interstate commerce across state lines did put them in a unique position to utilize the jurisdiction of the federal court. The lowest federal court, which is the district court, granted the injunction against AB 5, and they were reversed by the Ninth Circuit, which found that AB 5 was not inconsistent with and therefore preempted by federal law. So basically, the Ninth Circuit upheld AB 5 and said that it was not unconstitutional. The US Supreme Court declined to hear the dispute at the same time that the California Supreme Court did agree to hear it in the Castellanos case. So right now we are going through the California state system to determine whether or not Prop 22 should stand. Personally, I suspect that the US Supreme Court may be more inclined to get involved once the California Supreme Court has ruled on the issue, and if there's any dispute between states, especially within the same circuit. But for now, the US Supreme Court has decided to stay out of it. So what's this mean for these poor truckers who have lost their federal challenge? Fortunately for their California counterparts, they've had more success so far with California appellate courts, though that, of course, remains to be seen as to what the Supreme Court will do regarding Prop 22. If they do uphold Prop 22, the truckers don't really have much to worry about. But there are rumors that AB 5 may infect other states as well, though given the pushback by the voters, I'm personally a little bit skeptical. But if in fact Prop 22 is stricken, truckers will likely be classified and treated more as employees, which again is not ideal for their type of work. So there were some interesting thoughts kind of floating around on these trucker blogs out there as to possible solutions. Some of them had recommended moving outside of California, accepting their fate and becoming an employee, or agreeing to deliver only to California and not from California. The last option in particular is interesting because, of course, if they deliver to California and are injured in California, they may still be subject to the California workers' compensation system, which is more likely favorable for them than whatever state they're based in, but likely to result in a ruling that they're an employee. To the extent that this may conflict with other litigation in their home state over other disputes regarding employment, this may or may not be problematic. though it's a bit speculative at this point since we do have Prop 22 mostly intact. So again, trucking is a somewhat unique industry with unique hazards because you have this mandatory long sedentary work, whereas even at a desk job, an employee can get up and walk around every once in a while. I suspect that most of us have been on a long car trip at least once in our lives, and if you've done the driving, you know how difficult it can get after a few hours. So some particular hazards do include accidents as a result of driver fatigue, and this is particularly dangerous if the driver is suffering from sleep deprivation, which can double or even quadruple the chances of an accident, depending on how much sleep the driver has gotten. It can also result in repetitive injuries from driving or loading and unloading, and drug use to enhance driving ability. So the next couple of slides have some statistics, which I'll go through pretty quickly because we do have quite a bit to cover here. In 2020, there were over 10 million single unit trucks and nearly 3 million combination tractor trailers registered in the US. In 2020, 302.1 billion miles were traveled by large trucks. So it's quite a bit. There are thousands of deaths and non-fatal workplace injuries in the transportation sector annually, including over 35,000 fatal crashes in 2022 throughout the US, with nearly 13% involving a large truck or bus. Approximately 8% of non-fatal crashes also involved a large truck or bus in 2022. Fatal crashes include police-reported crashes involving a motor vehicle, in which at least one person dies within 30 days of the crash. 26% of these crashes in 2020 were in work zones involving large trucks. Tire defects are the most common cause of truck accidents, and most accidents occur during the early afternoon and primarily on weekdays. Unfortunately, 68% of all truck fatalities are passenger vehicle occupants, so you don't want to be on the receiving end of a truck accident. Of course, employees are subject to OSHA rules and regulations, as are the employers, and that includes Cal OSHA in California. So I think it's always good to have good employer involvement and communication on a case to be able to present the best possible defense. But it is, of course, helpful to know how many workers are employed by the company and ideally how many independent contractors they utilize. And you'll want to know the structure of the company as well, if possible. This is always helpful, especially for psychiatric cases where there may be an issue of who's the supervisor and therefore what may be construed as a personnel action. It can also go to the question of employment when you're assessing the level of control the potential employer has, and you want to know how reasonable the assignments that have been given to the trucker are. So as we discussed before, long-haul truckers in particular may own and operate their own vehicle and may work for many companies at once. So of course, that's going to impact any analysis as to their employment status and other factors as to how much control the company had over their work. So specifically for the larger companies, they tend to have drivers who are employees because the company will own and maintain the vehicles, and there's less of a need to maximize the route efficiency since the company can already do that. So I think they tend to have more short-term jaunts since they tend to have more locations and more people available in various places to do local deliveries. But do keep in mind that these trucking companies will also have other personnel working for them to do the administrative tasks, and they will likely be more prone to the usual types of injury that you would generally see. So there are other types of injuries for trucking companies. Just as a general OSHA requirement, companies with more than 10 employees have to post their number of job-related injuries annually. These technicalities are a big one that injured workers do like to go after, as we see with things like workplace postings and MPN notices. So it's good for insurance companies to stay on top of employers to make sure that they are following these requirements. These postings must be displayed from February 1st through April 30th. And the posting has to have information about the number of employees and the hours worked, and it must be certified by a company executive. The posting doesn't have to be submitted to OSHA unless OSHA requests it, and the employers should maintain these records for at least 5 years, which is generally good practice anyway. It is a good idea to know how the employer's facility is laid out. I know that some insurance companies will do site visits. So keeping notes about the premises can be very helpful. And I actually, as an attorney, like to do site visits where I think that it can be helpful to the case. I have had a few cases in particular involving things like forklifts and trucks, where the position of things like posts, walls, and pallets can be really important. And it can be difficult to get that information as accurately as necessary from the employer, or to know what information may be missing from what you're being told. So you never know what you don't know until you go down there and check it out yourself. Where workplace injuries occur is, of course, relevant and important to things like whether it is in the course of employment or whether it is actually on employer-owned premises, especially to identify potential subrogation issues. So knowing things like when the employer operates and the hours during which the drivers come and go can also be useful. This can help assess the accuracy of an injured worker's story. So for instance, they say that they were working during a time when the employer, of course, was closed or not operating, can be really helpful. I know that I saw a few things like that during COVID when the business was shut down and the person tried to claim that they were injured while the business was not operating. So that can be really useful information to have. There are laws governing the number of hours that truck drivers are permitted to work, and those are at the federal and state levels. The purpose of these regulations is to try to limit fatigue-related accidents, since fatalities are a higher probability when a large truck or bus is involved. So effective in February of 2012, drivers were limited to 60 to 70 hours per week, which was down from 82 hours, which sounds like an awful lot to me. Drivers can still choose from a 60-hour 7-day option or a 70-hour 8-day option. So this means that the driver can either operate for 60 consecutive hours during a 7-day period or 70 consecutive hours over an 8-day period. But the driver has to take at least 34 consecutive hours off duty between these jobs. Of course, there is the infamous two-book issue with truck drivers, where many of them will maintain dual logs, one that is DOT compliant and the other which records the actual hours that they worked and are submitting for payment. Just as an aside, I actually represented the dependents of a truck driver in a death case a few years ago where the death was caused by DVT, which is, of course, a significant risk from a long-term sedentary position. And our clients brought us all the belongings that were found in the truck, which did in fact include a second set of books and some other rather interesting items I suppose one may want when on the road alone for hours on end. But the second set of books can of course subject the driver and the company to penalties, so that's something to keep in mind as well. The logbooks must detail the amount of time spent driving and spent resting. Makes sense. The logbooks must track mileage at each stop, and they have to be submitted to the trucking company within 13 days of completion. The logbooks should be maintained by the driver and the company, the trucking company. The driver should have them until the 20th of the following calendar month, the trucking company for 6 months. I still think that 5-year rule to maintain records is a good rule of thumb, but these are the requirements. So we do have a few slides at the end where we'll talk about artificial intelligence in the trucking industry, but there have been some uses for more advanced technology so far to help the drivers keep more detailed logs electronically. The DOT and actually the California DMV do have a physical exam requirement where the driver must be medically certified every 2 years in order to maintain a commercial license. So this is sort of a unique aspect of the trucking industry, and particularly for workers' compensation. It sort of can give us a little bit of a baseline, or potentially give us some insight into where we could find a baseline of the person's condition, and even really where they are every 2 years. That certification may, though, expire in less than 2 years if there is a medical condition that the doctor is monitoring. So it is, of course, good practice for the records of medical certification to be maintained by the trucking companies for their drivers. In my experience, the certifications do not have much detail about the person's medical condition, which probably would violate HIPAA. And it would likely be difficult to get the actual physical exam notes if the certification was received out of state. But it is helpful. It could potentially tell you which doctor did the certification, which could tell you who the primary care physician is, and sort of get you started on a medical discovery process to see which doctors may have records. And the medical certification basically just verifies that the person is mentally and physically capable of operating a commercial vehicle. An insured may sometimes require a personality test. So I think this is kind of an interesting aspect of this, and not a bad idea, but it does worry me personally a little bit about a potential argument for discrimination if it turns out a person is not hired due to a mental health condition. This is a little bit outside of our scope, but it would be really interesting to see those results of a personality test if you end up having a psych claim. So finding lodging and accommodation is a unique bump in the road, no pun intended, for some truckers who are on a route and have to stop to comply with the DOT hours requirements. This can cause them to deviate from their route, though of course they are still working and therefore would still be in the scope of their employment. Keep in mind too that what happens at the accommodations may arguably be work-related. I've gotten some very interesting cases involving hotel workers of strange goings-ons at hotels, and to the extent that a trucker is impacted by those events, there may be some work-related involvement there as well. So maintaining a safe and organized work environment at a trucking facility can help reduce injuries while loading and unloading vehicles, and I think that can be said for pretty much any employment location. Specific protocols should be set in place for where pedestrians will be, especially when the vehicles are in operation, and visibility should be as clear as possible. Don't forget about those warehouse and facility vehicles, such as forklifts, which need to also have their own set of safety protocols and procedures. You're of course going to see the use of this kind of equipment more frequently with a trucking type of facility. Forklifts need to be properly operational and equipped with the appropriate safety features, and one should never walk away from a forklift which is not properly in park. Probably a good rule of thumb for any vehicle. So the people operating the forklifts should also be properly trained and licensed, and the forklifts should be inspected periodically to make sure that they are operational. The trucks must also be properly maintained in order to optimize the safety of the driver and the surrounding vehicles, of course. Daily inspections should be performed, and a major annual inspection is required, and the brakes should also be tested regularly to ensure they are operational. As a good practice, truckers should not work on a hot engine and should not smoke while doing repairs. If a driver ignores these rules and is injured, you could potentially reduce your exposure by filing a serious and willful petition against the injured worker to decrease benefits. Mechanics should not wear jewelry, and I think that one is probably less of a basis for a serious and willful petition unless there is a strict policy regarding jewelry for mechanics. There should be proper protection available, including emergency wash stations. Failure to comply with these guidelines could subject the employer to a serious and willful action. So that's sort of the flip side of having a serious and willful action by the employee versus the employer. Routine repairs may be done on site at the trucking company's facility, so you could see injuries from mechanics as a result of that maintenance. So that again goes to the other types of employees that you may have aside from the actual truckers themselves and the unique types of injuries you may see with those employees. The types of injuries may be a basic specific injury, a general CT, or you could, in the case of mechanics, have sort of a unique chemical exposure case, which can get a little bit complicated. I will say I do see a lot of chemical exposure cases where the injured worker will claim that they were exposed to a chemical and therefore injured. But one thing to really keep in mind with these types of cases is to verify the type of chemical that the person was exposed to and to actually relate that chemical to the type of injury that they have. So simply being exposed to a chemical does not by its nature mean that you were injured. You have to actually show some kind of a link between the chemical that they were allegedly exposed to and the type of injury that they sustained. To the extent possible, it's a good idea to make sure the employer's maintenance facilities are OSHA compliant. And in the event that there is an accident and an injury, keep in mind that there could be subrogation potential if there was some kind of defect in the truck, or if maintenance and repairs were not properly conducted, if those maintenance and repairs were done by a third party. So these are the types of things that we can advise on issue spotting, but it's a good idea to potentially hire out subrogation counsel, which we do have at Bradford and Barthel, in the event that there is a third party possible liable party. All right, and with that, I'm going to hand it off to Nasir.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for everything. Just want to take this transition time. I'll be presenting slide starting at safety data sheets here. And again, just wanted to thank Kimberly for that transition. My contact information is at the end of the presentation. Feel free to reach out to me by email or anything else as far as phone calls you may have as far as presenting or any issues that may or may not relate to everything, but hopefully we're good to go. All right. So just a roadmap today. I will be presenting on the issues of safety data sheets. I will also be presenting on hazardous materials as well as battery recharging, transporting hazardous materials, robbery, first aid issues, growth of the trucking industry, improving gender ratio, which is obviously a goal of the industry in general, as well as providing trucking terms and talking about some of the different types of jobs that we deal with in the trucking industry. So starting off with safety data sheets. Safety data sheets are kind of the CYA for the employer. It lets everyone, including the employees, be aware of the different rights and exposures that are involved with the job. It's what I consider kind of the equivalent of employee notices in break rooms. It is recommended that all employees have a thorough knowledge of chemicals that they use or are exposed to when working. The benefit of doing so is that obviously it keeps everyone on the same page and lets everyone know what they should and what they should be aware of at the different job sites. Now, as far as safety data sheets, this is OSHA compliance is critical as far as avoiding risk. I know this seems like common sense, but for workers' compensation, as we all know, the best file is a closed file. At the same time, for employers, the best injury defense is no injury in the first place, right? So having this OSHA standard be considered and keeping aware of the hazard communication standard to align with the different laws is absolutely essential as well. And as of June 2015, there's a verification that the insured workers have been trained to understand SDSs and hazard labels. That's been well documented as well. Now, moving on to hazardous waste materials. The key is being aware of different precautions and mitigating / eliminating as much risk as possible. This seems like common sense, but we can never assume that something is actually within common sense. It's all about training and making sure everyone is aware. It includes employers working with mechanics and dealing with issues like sludge. And these are often terms that we use in common day, but these are also what cause the most injuries. Things like oil grease, solvents, dirt from routine operations that accumulate in maintenance facility floor drains. If those aren't treated properly initially, that's when we deal with more liability and more risk. So when everyone's trained properly and made aware of the precautions beforehand, that's what mitigates the exposure down the road and injuries. Now, we're dealing with common sense seemingly, but no smoking. I know it seems like common sense, but this I kind of akin to kind of the common sense statute of the labor code and life. You want to avoid smoking, especially around hazardous materials. I don't think there's any brain surgeons on the line right now, but none of us need to be brain surgeons to understand this as far as understanding everything. Now, gassing it up. The most common injuries that we deal with often deal with burns. Those of us who handle different truck cases have dealt with these type of situations, especially with older model trucks. We're dealing with burns that often result, and it often comes down to two factors. One is store and dispense fuels for its trucks, and how the employees are trained to deal with those type of situations. So the situation does change for diesel trucks, since diesel does have a higher flash point, but these are the different things that we have to deal with here. Now, gassing it up, similar here, similar to how most motor vehicle accidents occur within a few miles of someone's home. Same thing as far as gassing up for truck drivers. Most accidents actually involve spillage during refueling. So it may be oftentimes when we're driving next to our own home in common day, that's when the accidents occur. Similar to truck drivers here, most accidents actually occur when refueling, either outdoors, obviously outdoors, but during that process. So it's important for truck drivers and all of us to be aware of what the proper safety rules are for refueling trucks, determining if the fuel dispensing pumps are suitable, and if use of scales for weighing the different type of LPG gas are properly calibrated. Moving on to battery recharging. This is a growing concern in the community, and that's because battery recharging is becoming more common. As we drive around the roads, we see many more electric vehicles that we deal with, and same thing with the trucking industry. So there's vent caps. I don't want to get too technical because I know they may be a little bit too technical, but vent caps should be kept in place to avoid different types of electrolyte sprays. By doing so, it should hopefully reduce and hopefully eliminate different type of exposures that can take place. And those of us who deal with claims, most of us on the phone today, on the call today, we deal with different types of injuries, specific and CTs. So for this, the exposure being limited can reduce CTs over the course of an employee's career and employment. So it's not just specific injuries that we want to avoid, but obviously we want to make sure we avoid things like CT injuries as well. And this is the best practice to follow. So transporting hazardous materials. Most of us have seen the different trucks on the road. Mostly it's if we're driving before 5 a.m. Regulations include limiting time durations for the different trucks that are on the road, as well as limiting the routes that the different trucks can take. For example, here in the Bay Area, some of the big rig hazardous material transporting trucks aren't allowed on certain freeways. That way it reduces the risk, but it also can increase the risk for different freeways, right? So the standards really try to eliminate or try to reduce exposure for the community as a whole and public as a whole. And they do so again by limiting routes, limiting drive times as well. Now, this is the federal regulation section that governs compliance for transporting hazardous materials. It's Regulation 49, CFR 100 through 185. And the regulations include things on shipping labels, as well as shipping papers and placards as well. Now moving on to different instances where we've seen different types of accidents / injuries involving truck drivers. Surprise, surprise, they're not always with individuals who are actually driving a vehicle. Sometimes you have truckers who are overnight, they are in their cab, and they unfortunately deal with different types of robberies and instances such as that. So one thing that's being trained of, especially over the last decade or two, is common sense applicability. If someone is robbed, it's less risk is less exposure. Many are trained to simply hand over what's being asked for. And that's not only for the safety of the truck driver, which is paramount, but also for eliminating the risk overall. It's easier to replace, a couple $100s in cash and a watch versus, months and months and months of PD or hospital expenses. So common sense prevails for robberies as well as the trucking industry in general. First aid, limiting the extent of injuries is part of accident and risk prevention. Different things like CPR and learning AED on site is very important as well. So training is vital for ongoing employees to make sure that if and when they are presented with incidents involving exposure, that they know how to properly mitigate the damage and properly try and treat individuals as much as possible to limit everything and get everyone back on the same track as soon as possible. Now, moving on to the growth of the trucking industry. Interestingly enough, despite the fact that it seems like everything is virtual and Amazon related today, there's actually a shortage of truck drivers. The ATA has indicated that the shortage could swell at over 160,000 drivers within about 5 years. So I think that can be attributed to increased population as well as increased need. So again, despite the fact that it seems like everything is virtual these days, the reality is that there is a need for increased amount of drivers that the industry needs as a whole. So as far as historically, to no surprise, historically, trucking industry has been a male-dominated industry in terms of numbers. There is a shift in that trend upward as far as female drivers. Women today make up about 7% of the industry's driving population, but as we'll get into later, that is sparking upwards as far as trending upwards as far as new drivers and as well as overall female drivers on the road today. And that has been a focus of the trucking industry as a whole as far as improving the gender ratio. And the reasons are plentiful, right? I mean, if half the population is male, then half the population is female, which means there can easily be an increase of female drivers to help the industry as a whole. And the purpose of the index over here, the WIT index, is to better quantify the number of women truck drivers and management team members in the industry on a national level. Now, here we talked about women drivers currently being about 6 or 7% of the entire industry. Women make up about, as of a few years ago, they made up about 6.6% of the 3.5 million truck drivers on the road. My estimation is probably in the next 5 to 10 years, I would probably put my own money saying that's probably going to increase, probably double. So I think within the next, by 2030, 2035, we could easily be looking at probably 10 to 12, 13% of overall female truck drivers, which would be a dramatic increase, especially considering where we were about 15, 20, 30 years ago in that regard. Again, the trend is upward as far as female truck drivers on the road. The WIT indicates this is a healthy trend, indicating there are more fleets and they're more serious about understanding of the gender divide, which could hopefully pave the way for creative initiatives to improve the gender ratio that's currently at at play today. Some general trucking terms. For those of us who deal with trucking cases, these type of acronyms and words are something we deal with, but just for us to be familiar with, gives us all an understanding of the trucking industry. I'll go over some of those terms. Transloading deals with transfer of goods from one mode of transportation to another en route to the ultimate destination. We got drayage, which refers to specialty logistics that carries freight over a short distance. Drayage companies take containers in and out of warehouses, rail terminals, ports, and harbors. Rail drayage, similar, deals with the movement of intermodal container by truck from the shipper origin to the rail ramp, and also from the rail ramp to the receiver destination. We have intermodal transportation, which is basically using 2 or more modes of freight, such as rail and truck, to deliver goods. We have cartage, which is the process of transporting goods by land. Cartage basically means the actual cost of transporting goods from one place to another. Now, cha-ching, highest paid trucking jobs. To no surprise, those of us who watch the History Channel, we understand ice road trucking is a very lucrative industry. For those of us who don't live in or around the North Pole, they're less common. But generally, the more expertise that the job requires, the more risk, the higher pay is going to be for the trucking industry in general. As far as prevailing wages, one of the top reasons why many have gravitated towards the trucking industry over the last several decades have been the pretty generous hourly rate, as well as the overtime. Double time is pretty much gotten rid of for safety reasons entirely, but there's a very lucrative hourly rate and overtime incentives that truck drivers are offered, which has been why it's been a pretty popular industry for the last several decades. There may be a shortage right now, but I think trending upwards as far as pay in hopes of recruiting and making it more lucrative for drivers in the future. Wage thieves, these are basically the commissioner's office has received different types of wage claims. So the commissioner's office is just trying to make more incentive for everyone to comply with different wage regulations to prevent unpaid wages, unpaid reimbursement, etc. And as far as wage thieves, the whole point is to ensure responsibility and safety. And as far as wage thieves, we also want to avoid exploitation. And by doing so, I think commissioners have also said, hey, they just want to have an honest and equal playing field. Obviously, for those who violate this, there's different exposures such as penalties, audit issues, sanctions. So by giving everyone an honest playing field, it really does make sure that there's less exposure down the road as well. And I know Kimberly briefly touched base on some of the case law, but there are different types of noteworthy cases that have been recent as far as regarding the employment relationship and dual employment, which we briefly touched base about. The prevailing case is Jesus Ortega Gonzalez. In that case, WCAB denied reconsideration, affirming the WCJ's finding that the injured worker was a truck driver for major transportation. And it also dealt with dual employment, where the injured worker was sent to one employer to work for another employer, and both employers have direction, control over details of the employee's work, and both benefit from the work. These type of things bring up different standards that we deal with as far as general, special employer relationship, etc. And thank you all again. I will be transferring it over now to Mr. Eric Hunter, who will take it away.
We're going to go ahead and talk about where things are heading next. And in doing this, I think it's important to get an understanding of AI. Essentially, we hear the terminology a lot, and we're looking at how it applies to the future of trucking. It's really important to think about then, okay, so what is it that's actually happening behind the scenes? So I want to go ahead and go over a few things here. One of them is that when you're thinking about large language model AI, which is what you're essentially seeing all over the press for the last almost a year now, 9-10 months, ended up getting viral end of last year. Large language model AI, generative AI means the chat GPT type of elements, okay? So with this, what we're gonna go ahead and talk about with that is how is that built? So I was in Hamburg this last May, and in that time, I had the privilege to work with NVIDIA and a number of different companies focusing on supercomputers. The future is part of that conference. And they were focusing on a lot of different complex issues around digital twin modeling. And the reason I want to bring this here is the future of trucking and AI with trucking. What it has to really do with is it really has to do with how do you implement AI into the visual plane and then augmenting the trucking experience, okay? So when thinking about that, the way that current large language model is built is you end up taking a large networked area of supercomputers, okay? And they're all running on AI-driven chips. We'll use NVIDIA as an example because a lot of people are familiar with NVIDIA as a company, running GPUs, graphical processor units. It's relevant because if we're going to be talking about the AI that's going to be coming into trucking and you bring in these new elements, what happens is you need to have all of these supercomputers running together. And what we found is that with scale, with enough of them in the right configuration, you'll have incremental, then it jumps to exponential. And as it jumps to exponential, meaning exponential process, output, understanding, then as it's trained, it needs to be the amount of data that's been pushed into this has to be reduced down and refined relative to the specific area that we're looking at. In this case, as this comes into the trucking industry, you're going to end up having a lot of different companies that are manufacturing behind the scenes and integrating these aspects into it, okay? And so as that ends up taking place, and you start bringing in this different level of AI that, to quote NVIDIA's lead data scientist on this that her present in Hamburg, that the AI that built their neural net, that essentially brings their digital twin, they were building this representation, visual representation, they didn't understand how the large language model AI actually did it, but it worked, so they had to reverse engineer it. It's an extraordinary statement, an extraordinary admission, but then also part of the reality we're facing today. Another quote that was presented then was that anyone who tells you that they understand how their neural net actually works is probably kidding themselves. And I want to make sure that I can give that perspective when it comes into what it is we're talking about with AI in the future of trucking. Obviously, there have been different elements and iterations of AI that have become a part of this, where you'll have different sensors within vehicles that we're familiar with. Cameras, sensors, sort of this automated pilot. Sometimes when people think about this, they immediately go to, well, the future of AI and trucking means automation, but not necessarily. And I think that it's really important for this audience to understand where when you start bringing in AI-driven augmentations and AI-driven augmentations around how the driver is going to perceive, how the driver is going to be able to see the reality around them, how they're going to actually, there's going to be interpretations from the AI on weather and road conditions and surroundings. So these are going to have to be integrated in through the screens and perhaps wearables that the trucker would have. As the audience can certainly imagine, there's a lot of liability potentials that would have to be navigated through with this. It isn't necessarily this seamless transition that takes place where people are automated and AI is driving the whole thing. Essentially, you have this augmentation of the driver and augmentation of the experience, and then what does that mean? And currently, when it comes to large language model AI and how it's trained, I'd have to say that right now the case law is anything but settled. So right now, there is a whole lot of pending to-come litigation on this front that will end up shaping a tangible path forward for us as we move forward in this arena. So I just wanted to make sure that we could touch on some points with this, give a little bit of a large level background and understanding of how the AI is currently built and then delivered, also with the understanding that once that large language model is built that I described, it can then be the goals for it to be deployed through a single GPU, meaning once it's built behind the scenes, it can be deployed through, in this case, the trucker, the experience, and then the tracking, et cetera, that augmentations that take place. But I know that we want to be able to finish in time for a few questions, so I'm going to go ahead and transition it off from here. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Eric. Thank you, Nasir. Thank you, Kimberly. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. We actually don't have any questions, which is very rare. And so, Kimberly, Nasir, do you have anything else you want to add today?
No, I think just, we touch base. I think the main thing is this stuff, we don't become experts on this area usually until we have the case that deals with it, right? So if and when it comes up, our firm is here for you. Kimberly, myself, our trucking division, we want to be there for you every step of the way. So reach out to us, email us, call us, text us, artificial intelligence, whatever communication you want with us, and we're here for you. So now looking forward to answering your questions on trucking as well as any other comp issues you may have down the road.
Actually, we do have one question. I think this will be an easy one. Will part 2 go further into employment relationship?
The focus of part 2 is really going to be on the injuries that truckers sustain. We're going to go into that in a little more detail since that is such a huge focus. Obviously, workers' compensation is the crux of the injuries and the extent of the injuries. And we're going to talk about some defenses and the way the medical reporting, things like that work, strategies for cross-examination. That's really going to be the focus of part 2. The employment relationship is still kind of an ongoing pending issue, so we'll have more on that to come.
Okay, thank you. All right, everybody, we're going to end a couple minutes early, which is very unlike us, so I think that will be nice. We can all move on with our day. Thank you again for taking time out of your very busy schedules to join us. I hope you learned something new today. 2 quick things. Certificates for CE and MCLE will be emailed this afternoon, and I will go ahead and include a copy of the PowerPoint for those of you who asked. And our next live webinar is on September 28th at noon on Bye-Bye Vocational Apportionment with Louis Laris and John Kamen. So you can register for that now. And in the meantime, I hope you guys enjoy the rest of your summer and have a great rest of your week. Take care, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.